Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and this video is going to look at a photo Scott Fischer took from the South Summit on May 10, 1996, to see if we can make sense of the various conflicting accounts about what happened on the upper mountain that day. The photograph was taken at 1 p.m. from the South Summit, looking up at the Hillary Step and the start of the summit ridge. The actual summit is not visible from Fischer's location. On May 10th, 24 people reached the summit, 16 Westerners and 8 Sherpa. In the photo, 16 climbers are visible, 17 if that blob there is actually 2 climbers, but I will just assume it is 16 for this analysis. Krakauer, Harris, and Bukrev are above and out of view on their way to the summit, and Scott Fischer is taking the photo. So 20 of the 24 who summited are accounted for, with the remainder being in between Scott Fischer and the last person in this photo, somewhere along the traverse over from the South Summit. Of the 16 Westerners who climbed above South Summit, all of them reached the summit, and 5 of them would lose their life on descent. I'll list the ones who perished here with their summit times. Andy Harris summited 1:25 p.m., Yasuko Namba 2:15, Rob Hall 2:30, Scott Fischer 3:40, and Doug Hansen shortly after 4 p.m. Of the 8 Sherpa, all reached the summit and all descended without any major problems, even though no Sherpa reached the summit prior to 2 p.m. I mention the Sherpas separately here because the Sherpas were not causing any bottlenecks. The Sherpa climbed extremely efficiently and were able to scale the Hillary Step quickly and have up to 3 of them climbing it at the same time. Now, some accounts put 28 climbers as climbing above South Summit, notably Lukashevsky's After the Wind. However, the Himalayan database has no records of those climbers, and if there were 28, it would mean the additional 4 were Sherpas that for some reason did not want credit for their summit. As such, I use the 24 climbers who are known to have been climbing that day and do not include the 4 phantom Sherpas. There are a couple of things to note about this photograph. First, at this point in time, which is approximately 1 p.m., the climbers are spread out between South Summit and the actual summit. 6 of the 16 Westerners are above the Hillary Step, and 1 is just at the top of the Hillary Step. That is Sandy Pittman. Thus, there is not this huge bottleneck at the Hillary Step at this time. If all these climbers climbed the step as fast as Sandy Pittman did, there would have never been a bottleneck at the Hillary Step. Thus, at 1 p.m., 7 of the 16 Westerners were at the top of the Hillary Step or above, leaving only 9 Westerners below. Yasuko Namba is one of the Westerners below the step, and she would take an inordinate amount of time to scale the step and was responsible for the delays. Doug Hansen would as well, but Hansen was at the back of the group, and the only person he slowed down was Scott Fischer. There is an interesting simulacra developing around Yasuko Namba. Currently, any search for her will show her in a purple down suit, as that is what her character was wearing in a 2015 movie about 1996. However, in the climb, Bukrev includes a photo of her clearly showing she wore a red down suit. So of the 17 people below the Hillary Step at this point, 8 are Sherpa, 3 are guides, Mike Groom, Rob Hall, and Scott Fischer, and 6 are Western climbers. Now, Mike Groom was an extremely strong guide, and while Bukrev is rightly recognized for his efforts that day, Groom also made extraordinary efforts to save both Beck Weathers and Yasuko Namba. I will get into Mike Groom's account in more detail in future videos because his book, Sheer Will, has a very different version of events than appear in Krakauer's Into Thin Air. In this video, I will only discuss 2 of the numerous contradictions between Groom and Krakauer's accounts. And in both cases, I believe that Groom's account is accurate and Krakauer's fabricated. That is, I do not believe that Krakauer simply misremembered things, as there are photos that he could have used to refresh his memory as to exactly what happened. Instead, Krakauer invented the story knowing the photos contradicted his invented version. He even puts those photos in his book, The Illustrated Edition. The 6 clients below the step are from Mountain Madness, Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, and Lena Gamelgard. From Adventure Consultants, Yasuko Namba and Doug Hansen. And from the Taiwanese team, Makalu Gao. The Chinese team was not a commercial expedition, but I will consider Gao as a client, even though he had no commercial guide. The photo depicts the busiest the Hillary Step would be that day. There is no throng of climbers waiting to come up. This is it. The massive bottleneck Krakauer wrote about: 6 Western climbers, 3 experienced guides, and 8 of the top climbing Sherpas. This photo was taken at 1 p.m., so if the turnaround time was indeed 2 p.m., most of these climbers would have a realistic chance to reach the summit by the 2 p.m. turnaround. I will point out briefly that there is a major difference between the accounts of what time Rob Hall had set for the turnaround time, with some people insisting it was 1 p.m. However, given that Rob Hall didn't turn around at 1 p.m., I will assume he had either set it to be 2 p.m. or he modified it to 2 p.m. at the South Summit. Ultimately, only the 3 climbers who are already above the step and the 3 that are out of view on the photo would reach the summit by 2 p.m., but nearly all would reach the summit by 2:30 p.m., which is when Rob Hall summited. Groom, Namba, Pittman, Fox, Martin summiting slightly before that. The one thing that is curious about Into Thin Air is that it never explicitly states that Rob Hall summited at 2:30. It also never states what time Namba summited, the 2:15 time being stated by Mike Groom on page 280 of his book. Krakauer also writes there was not a hard turnaround time. Krakauer's exact phrase is, "At Rob's suggestion, we decided to enforce a 2 o'clock turnaround time. Anybody who wasn't within spitting distance of the summit by 2 p.m. had to turn around and go down." Now, I do not know what spitting distance is, but Namba was on the summit at 2:15, and given the high winds near the summit, it is entirely possible that someone could spit that distance, provided they were going with the wind. Thus, Andy Harris summited well before the turnaround time, and Yasko Namba was within spitting distance as the rule required, and yet both would perish that day. Namba and Groom only stayed on the summit 15 minutes and headed down as soon as Rob Hall got there at 2:30. The Mountain Madness team, except for Martin Adams and Clev Schoening, remained on the summit for approximately 1 hour, when the bulk of them headed down at 3:10 when Beitelman left with Fox and Tim Martin. All of the Mountain Madness clients survived without any significant injuries. As I detailed in a prior video, that is likely because Mountain Madness clients were provided with significantly more oxygen than the Adventure Consultant clients. So back to Fischer's photo. This is Lobsang, lead climbing Sherpa for Mountain Madness, in the white Sherpa suit. And one cannot fault him for not pulling the plug at this point in time. His team had a fairly clear Hillary step in front of him. Pittman was already at the top, and Mike Groom was there to assist Yasuko Namba. And had Namba not taken 30 minutes to climb the step, as reported by Lena Gamelgard, likely the bulk of these climbers would have reached the summit by the 2 p.m. turnaround time. Had Namba taken only 15 minutes rather than the 30 she actually took, she would have reached the summit by the 2 p.m. turnaround time. As it is, by 2:30, all the Westerners had reached the summit, except Doug Hansen, Mac Logau, and Scott Fischer. For some timing, Jon Krakauer would make the climb from where Scott Fischer is taking this photo from to the summit in 1 hour and 12 minutes, including the time waiting for Bukrev to fix the rope at the Hillary step. Beitelman and Adams will be on the summit 25 minutes after this photo was taken, Clev Schoening 45 minutes after the photo, and Yasuko Namba will be on the summit 1 hour and 15 minutes after this photo was taken. Thus, while Rob Hall would bring up the rear of the main group of his clients reaching the summit at 2:30, this was largely caused by the extended delay in Namba scaling the Hillary step. It was not unreasonable for Hall to be thinking at the time this photo was taken that there was a very good chance they make the 2 p.m. summit time. One problem was that although Rob Hall had extra oxygen bottles at South Summit, Beck Weathers and Frank Fischbeck had turned around early, thus they were not using their third bottle that the Sherpas had carried to South Summit, but Rob Hall did not adjust the flow rate of the remaining climbers and distribute the oxygen. Had Rob Hall given those extra bottles to Yasuko and Doug Hansen, they could have cranked their oxygen up to 4 liters per minute until they reached the summit and likely avoided all the deaths except that of Scott Fischer. This is also why experienced guides lead from lower down the mountain, so they can have a complete view of the climbers and the oxygen situation. Although it would have been obvious to Rob Hall as soon as the 2 climbers turned around early that he would have extra bottles at South Summit, it is not clear why he did not give these to the 2 slowest climbers. Indeed, at South Summit, he only had 3 clients left, Krakauer, Namba, and Hansen, and Krakauer didn't need an extra bottle at that point in time. Thus, the choice of what to do with the extra 2 bottles should have been obvious. Later, Hall would ask that some bottles be sent up the mountain for him and Doug Hansen, but no one was in a condition to carry them, and by then it was simply too little too late. Next, we see that the ropes above the Hillary step are being fixed, and yet 3 people are well above on their way to the summit: Krakauer, Buchrev, and Harris, not being visible in the photograph. The biggest misconception is that people were waiting for ropes to be fixed. Ropes did not need to be fixed for people to reach the summit, as this photograph shows. The ropes are being fixed as a safety measure, and Bottleneck, the Mountain Madness guide, who is leading the rope fixing, will be on the summit 25 minutes after this photo was taken. The photo makes it clear that not a single person was delayed by the rope fixing efforts above the Hillary step, and no rope was fixed along the traverse. This whole path down here, they just used the ropes from the previous season. Nothing was fixed there, and they all got across just fine. I'll get into the alleged rope fixing delays lower down on the mountain, but you can probably guess there are photos that tell a very different story. For example, in this photo, that is Jon Krakauer, looking down towards the balcony where he claimed to have waited an entire hour and a half. You can see that no ropes are fixed. There was no need to fix the ropes. No one fixed them, and people were not falling off the mountain, even though there was a violent storm on the descent. The vast majority of the route in 1996 was never fixed and did not need to be fixed. Unlike today, where every inch of the route is fixed with ropes, in 1996, climbers were expected to be able to handle large portions of the route without the aid of fixed ropes. There was only one incident on the area below South Summit where there was a delay, and the account from Mike Groom is completely different from Jon Krakauer's. The guides decided to fix some rope to make one area more secure, and this is the way Mike Groom describes it. At the base of the steep rise leading directly to the South Summit, we caught up to Neil, who was about to fix a rope to this difficult section. I intended to help uncoil the rope from Neil and belay him, but a sudden attack of stomach cramps stopped me in my tracks. Bent over in pain, I seriously contemplated heading down. "Tie this end to something solid, will you?" yelled Neil as he tossed the end of the rope. It fell across my back as I was fearing losing control of my bowels. Impatient at my seemingly unhelpful attitude, Aunt Dorje snatched up the rope from my back and secured it to something solid. 15 minutes later, I started up the rope that Neil had just fixed. Later, Groom reports Krakauer was right behind him, so it is not clear why Krakauer did not see Groom, an adventure consultant's guide, was indeed working just fine with Neil Bottleneck, a Mountain Madness guide, in fixing the ropes. It was not until Groom had severe stomach cramps that there was a problem. It is not clear why Krakauer could not see that this was the obvious reason why there was a small delay in fixing the rope, and that was one of the very, very few ropes they fixed on the mountain that day. Instead, Krakauer claims there was no fixing ropes because of some miscommunication or inter-team rivalry. However, I believe Groom's account is accurate, as he was the one of the people actually fixing the ropes. But Mike Groom having stomach cramps didn't fit Krakauer's narrative, so it gets dropped from his book. Groom's book was published in 1997, so much like Gamelgard's, Krakauer had access to it for his postscript in 1999, which mentions nothing from either of those accounts, preferring instead to argue with a dead man. Groom's problems would return while he was rappelling down the Hillary step, causing him to empty his bladder into his downsuit, which ended up filling up his left boot with its contents. Shortly after filling his left boot with urine, Groom would come across a stranded Krakauer and give Krakauer his oxygen. Krakauer's account in Into Thin Air leaves it vague as to whether Krakauer returned the bottle to Groom once Krakauer had picked up his own. Groom's account highly implies that Krakauer kept the bottle, and I will get into that in a future video analyzing exactly what happened at South Summit that day. For now, we need to look just briefly at the issue of why people were waiting at South Summit. The reason people were waiting had nothing to do with fixing ropes. You can climb the entire southeast ridge except maybe the Hillary step without ropes. The day before, the Montenegrin team got to the base of the Hillary step, so there was no absolute need for additional fixed ropes below the Hillary step. The one that Groom and Bottleneck had fixed earlier was just because they wanted some additional safety over a difficult portion. The reason for the delays at South Summit was bringing up the oxygen. You can climb without fixed ropes just fine, but for most people, they cannot climb without oxygen. I will get into the details of that in a future video, but the narrative that there was a bunch of inexperienced climbers that couldn't climb 10 feet without someone pulling them up a fixed rope is not supported by the photographs taken that day. Instead, the photographs show large portions without fixed ropes and climbers making it up just fine. Going back to the Fischer photo, I'll compare it with various conflicting stories of the climb on the upper mountain. Although most people are familiar with Jon Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, that was not published until a year after the events took place. Prior to its publication, Krakauer was telling a very different story, and after the book was published, Krakauer's story would continue to change after both Lobsang and Bukrev were killed in other mountaineering accidents. So let's go over the timeline of Krakauer's stories, see how it changed with each telling, and try to determine which, if any, of the versions are correct. The major revisions to Krakauer's story are his original account on May 20th, 1996, the article in the September issue of Outside Magazine, which was published in August 1996, the book Into Thin Air, published in May of 1997, Into Thin Air Illustrated Edition, published November 1998, and the postscript to his Into Thin Air, written in August of 99. Each of the above revisions contains alterations, embellishments, omissions, and outright contradictions, which will be analyzed to try to determine what story Krakauer was trying to tell and how it kept changing until he found something that worked. So on May 20th, 1996, just 9 days after the deaths of 4 of his adventure consultant teammates, Krakauer gave an interview to Outside Online. In that interview, Krakauer makes many claims that later get deleted from his best-selling book. For instance, he claims to have gone outside his tent during the storm and banged pots and pans together. When in his book, published a year later, he remained in his tent the entire time. This video will not look at every discrepancy between the first interview and his later book, as nearly every major fact gets altered in the book. This video will just discuss Jon Krakauer's climb above the Hillary step and a few things down slightly below there because of the consequence of what happened up high. Describing the climb above the Hillary step, Krakauer stated in the May 20, 1996 interview, Anatoly, Neil, Andy Harris, and I were out in front fixing ropes. I assumed that we would fix the ropes, and they, the clients, would all wait at South Col. He means South Summit. But at some point, soon after we started fixing rope, the more eager and impatient clients were right on my butt, right behind me. As soon as the rope was fixed, they were right there, the clients. I guess they were. So it was all Scott's clients. Some of them were straggling, and some were right there. That is a fairly vivid personal account of Krakauer's own climb, where he is out front fixing the ropes and felt peeved that the Mountain Madness clients were crowding him, just waiting for him to tie the rope in to ride his parka tails to the summit. However, when his book, Into Thin Air, was published a year later, this vivid personal account is nowhere to be found. Instead, Krakauer wrote he was not involved with fixing the ropes as he climbed ahead of the rope fixers because he was running out of oxygen. At the top of the step, I shared my concern with Bottleneck and asked whether he minded if I hurried ahead to the summit instead of pausing to help him string the last coil of rope along the ridge. Go for it, he graciously offered. I'll take care of the rope. It is not possible for both of those accounts to be correct. Either Krakauer was fixing the ropes or he was not. Bukrev had fixed the rope up the Hillary step, and no ropes were fixed in between South Summit and the Hillary step, as they just used ropes from previous seasons. As such, the only ropes to be fixed were above the Hillary step, and Krakauer writes in his book that he opted out of fixing the ropes and he headed to the summit directly. Now, let's look at the photo taken by Scott Fischer. A black and white version appears in Into Thin Air Illustrated Edition on page 240. The illustrated edition was published November 17, 1998, and while the text of the book remains the same, the captions of the photos present a different timeline that does not match up with Krakauer's book. The caption reads, Scott Fischer at the back of the pack took this photo looking up from the South Summit at 1 p.m. 3 climbers, Neil Beitelman, Martin Adams, and Clev Schoening, are visible above the Hillary step, en route to the summit. Anatoly Bukrev, Jon Krakauer, and Andy Harris are out of sight above, just below the top. Now, if you turn the page back in that exact same book, Krakauer claims that he was at the base of the Hillary step at 1 p.m. So either Krakauer got the caption wrong, or the original text is wrong, and spoiler alert, his original text is wrong. And just so there is no confusion that Krakauer might not have been paying attention to the time, he claims to have been studying his watch at 1 p.m. and knew exactly what time it was and exactly where he was on the mountain. In the end, Bukrev, a senior guide and the only one of us who had climbed Everest previously, claimed the honor. He's talking about fixing the rope up the Hillary step. With Beitelman paying out the rope, he did a masterful job of leading the pitch, but it was a slow process, and he painstakingly ascended toward the crest of the step. I nervously studied my watch and wondered whether I might run out of oxygen. My first canister had expired at 7 a.m. on the balcony, after lasting about 7 hours. Using this as a benchmark, at the south summit, I'd calculated that my second canister would expire around 2 p.m., which I'd stupidly assume would allow plenty of time to reach the summit and return to the south summit to retrieve my third oxygen bottle. But now it was already after 1 p.m., and I was beginning to have serious doubts. So we first need to determine which of Krakauer's timelines is correct, the one that appears on page 239 or the one that appears on 241 of the illustrated edition. As I stated in a previous video, climbing from the base of the Hillary Step to the summit in just 12 minutes would require a vertical ascent rate that is simply unbelievable, and given that Krakauer himself updated the timeline to fit what is in the photograph, it appears the photograph accurately represents the situation at 1 p.m., and Krakauer's account that he was at the base of the Hillary Step at 1 p.m. is not accurate. Nor is his description of the ascent being slow by Bukrev, as this photo shows the ropes were already in place from previous years, and Bukrev had little to do other than climb up and tie into the old ropes, the old anchors with the new rope. So back to the Fischer photo. It is showing the climbers above the Hillary Step fixing the rope. You can see Neil Beitelman, a guide for Mountain Madness, out in front taking the rope to the next fix point. You can see Martin Adams, a client for Mountain Madness, kneeling down to fix the rope to the anchor. That is the way a rope fixing team works. You run the rope up to a point you are going to tie it into. One person stops and ties it into the anchor, while the other leapfrogs to get to the next tie-in point. The third climber is Clev Schoening, also a Mountain Madness client. It is not clear whether he is assisting with rope fixing, but he is certainly not riding Krakauer's butt to the summit. The scene is accurately depicted in Bukrev's book, The Climb, in which Beitelman is being quoted. I said, "Fine." I uncoiled the rope. Martin Adams was below me. I asked Martin if he would help me pay out the rope and tie the end to an anchor, which he did. I started up. I made it maybe 20 or 30 feet until the rope caught in rocks. Martin finally helped me untangle the rope from the rock. So, given this photograph, Krakauer was not fixing the ropes, and no Mountain Madness clients were anywhere near him. While Krakauer is out of view well on his way to the summit, the Mountain Madness clients are the ones fixing the ropes and are nowhere near Krakauer. Bukrev is the only Mountain Madness person near him, and Bukrev summited a full 5 minutes prior to Krakauer, so there's no possibility it was Bukrev riding Krakauer's butt to the summit. Andy Harris was an adventure consultant guide, and Krakauer an adventure consultant client. It appears Krakauer invented his May 20th story from thin air, falsely stating that he was fixing the ropes and that Mountain Madness were the bad guys just riding his butt to the summit. This appears to be a calculated manipulation of the facts that Krakauer dropped after Scott Fischer's photos were developed, as this photo proved his account was not possible. Krakauer also misstates the description of the final summit ridge in his May 20th, 1996 interview. The final summit ridge is the most technical part of the climb. There's no way to pass anybody. It's steep, 60 degrees, really good snow, perfect snow ice, but it's steep. Not all of it was fixed. So there were sections where you can't F up. If you trip or you don't get a good ice axe placement and you trip, you're going to take the big ride. So people were trying to be careful there. So I don't know who else ran out of oxygen. I suspect I wasn't the only one. He is trying to explain why he ran out of oxygen. Now, as I'll get into in an upcoming video, the reason he ran out of oxygen is because he left before the oxygen was brought up. People were not waiting at the south summit for the rope to be fixed. They were waiting for the oxygen to be brought up. I'll explain why that was and why you simply can't blame the Sherpas like Krakauer does. And I'll do that in a future video. For now, we can check whether the final summit ridge is indeed a 60-degree slope. This is me looking down the final summit ridge, and while I never climbed on the south, the slope looks like it's about 15 degrees, and it seems that it would be very easy to pass people if necessary. Turning back to our Google Earth Pro view of the final summit ridge and using some basic trigonometry, you get a slope of about 15 degrees. It is not clear why Krakauer was so mistaken about the nature of the final summit ridge, but perhaps that is why he needed a guide to assist him to the summit, because of his mistaken belief that it was 60 degrees and not possible to pass other people. In any case, his account of why he ran out of oxygen also differs significantly between his May 20th, 1996 account and the account published in Into Thin Air. So let's take a look at both and see if we can figure out which one is accurate. In the May 20 interview, Krakauer simply runs out of oxygen as he is descending. The delays, even on the way back, by the time I got to the Hillary Step, I got there just in time for the major traffic jam, and my oxygen ran out at the top of the Hillary Step, and I had to wait there. I didn't want to try to weave my way through the crowd without oxygen because I was so dizzy. I didn't want to fall and blow it, so I just waited. I stood there at the Hillary Step for maybe half an hour. So in May 96, his story was that he runs out of oxygen, and then he decides not to descend, because if he had oxygen, he could have just asked people to pause for a minute or two while he clipped in and rappelled down. But without oxygen, he didn't think he could make a quick descent, and he didn't want to clog up the step. However, that version makes it obvious that Krakauer screwed up and ran out of oxygen because he was impatient and wanted to be out in front. So the version in his book, Into Thin Air, is completely different. 15 minutes after leaving the summit, I reached the top of the Hillary Step, where I encountered a clot of climbers shuffling up the single strand of rope, and my descent came to an enforced halt. As I waited for the crowd to pass, Andy arrived on his way down. "Jon," he asked, "I don't seem to be getting enough air. Can you tell me if the intake valve to my mask is iced up?" A quick check revealed a fist-sized chunk of frozen drool blocking the rubber valve that admitted ambient air into the mask from the atmosphere. I chipped it off with the pick of my ice axe and then asked Andy to return the favor by turning off my regulator in order to conserve my gas while the step cleared. He mistakenly opened the valve instead of closing it, however, and 10 minutes later, all my oxygen was gone. My cognitive functions, which had been marginal before, instantly went into a nosedive. I felt like I'd been slipped an overdose of a powerful sedative. Now, Andy Harris died on the climb, so there was no one to corroborate his story. However, with these oxygen systems, they make a hissing sound when oxygen is exiting the tube into the bladder bag. While you're climbing, you don't really notice it, but you can hear it when you're just standing there. For instance, if you wake up in the middle of the night and hear the hiss, you know you still have oxygen in your bottle. There's also a major difference between a low flow rate and a full flow rate. At full flow, the hiss is extremely loud. The full flow is 4 sea level liters per minute. At that altitude, it means approximately 12 liters a minute is coming out of a very small tube, and it makes a noise. It is difficult to believe that someone standing there could not hear the extremely loud hissing sound coming from an oxygen system he thought was turned off. Krakauer's early account was that he simply ran out of oxygen and then decided not to descend, and that is not consistent with his account here, that he first decided to not descend and only then asked Andy Harris to adjust the flow rate, and then it was 10 minutes after that he ran out of oxygen. Given the loud hissing sound of a 4 liter per minute flow, I do not find Krakauer's second account credible, which is the one that appears in the book. I will note that there is an account of Krakauer asking Groom to check his regulator flow at South Summit on the descent, and Groom noting it was at 4 liters per minute. However, Groom had already given him his oxygen bottle, and this was when Krakauer was stranded along the traverse from the South Summit. And when you screw the regulator into a bottle, you are looking directly at the regulator, and you can easily see the flow rate. Most likely, Krakauer turned it up to 4 at that time, given that he was unable to walk. It then appears that Krakauer kept the bottle Groom gave him earlier and put the new one into his pack. In Into Thin Air, he states he screwed the new bottle into the regulator. However, if that was the case, there would have never been a need to ask Groom to adjust it. Krakauer could have just adjusted the regulator when he screwed the new bottle in. Thus, it appears that Krakauer kept Groom's oxygen bottle, and Groom would later run out of oxygen helping others down the mountain. Now, to be clear, Krakauer accepts his role in this whole thing. In Into Thin Air, he wrote, "As I indicated earlier in these pages, my own actions may have contributed to the deaths of 2 of my teammates. On this point, I agree with Krakauer, and is one of the few things in Into Thin Air that is accurate. However, in the book, he never explains exactly why he feels that way. At least for Yasuko Namba, a legitimate view is that had he returned Groom's bottle when he got to his own bottle at South Summit, Groom could have used the oxygen himself or given it to Yasuko. And this point is largely glossed over in Into Thin Air, and Krakauer's account for the bottles in the book does not appear to be accurate. There's also a major discrepancy with Groom's account of his last interaction with Krakauer. On the descent from South Summit, there are essentially 2 completely different versions of what happened. On one side is Krakauer's version, which lines up with a version told by Beck Weathers. On the other is Mike Groom's account, which matches with events from Gamelgard's books and various statements Bidelman made in a transcript contained in Bukarev's The Climb. I will cover those 2 versions in detail in an upcoming video, but the Groom, Bidelman, Gamelgard account has Yasuko descending with Krakauer well below the balcony, while Krakauer claims he had no interaction with her since South Summit. As I will get into the upcoming video, the Groom, Bidelman, Gamelgard accounts are believable, and the Krakauer weather's accounts are not. And while Krakauer was under no obligation to assist Yasuko in the slightest, as a self-professed investigative journalist, he did have an obligation to state that a very different version of events existed. However, at this point, you should be realizing that Krakauer's account is not a journalistic telling of the events. Instead, it is a work of fiction, with Krakauer as a type of Gary Sue character who not only possesses great climbing skills, but the wisdom to pontificate on the mistakes of others, all the while remaining detached and unbiased in his investigative journalistic duties. Turning to another Gary Sue incident in the book Into Thin Air, he states he was waiting at the top of the Hillary Step when Sandy Pittman goes by. He claims he got to the top of the step at 1:32 p.m. However, in this photo taken at 1 p.m., Pittman is already at the top of the step. Krakauer says he perched precariously so that he could watch who was climbing the step, also a highly dubious claim, and he saw Pittman, Fox, Lobsang, and eventually Namba scale the step. For that to happen, absolutely no one could have moved from the time this photo was taken until Krakauer arrived back at the top of the step, which is simply not believable. Krakauer also explicitly states he watched Yasuko Namba climb the Hillary Step. I fuzzily remember Sandy Pittman climbing past as I waited bound for the summit, followed in an indeterminate time later by Charlotte Fox, and then Lobsang Jangbu. Yasuko materialized next, just below my precarious stance, but was fluxed by the last and steepest portion of the step. I watched helplessly for 15 minutes as she struggled to haul herself up the uppermost brow of rock, too exhausted to manage it. Finally, Tim Madison, who was waiting impatiently directly below her, put his hands beneath her buttocks and pushed her to the top. Again, a fairly vivid personal memory of Krakauer as he perched on top of the Hillary Step and watched Yasuko Namba climb it. The only problem is there's a completely different version from Mike Groom. Yasuko had regained her gritty determination, and by the time we had overcome the final obstacle of the step itself, Andy and John were returning from the summit. Meeting them on the narrows of the summit ridge created a delicate passing maneuver, and Andy wanted to make our meeting even more memorable by greeting me with a high five. Of the two accounts, Groom's is far more believable. In the 1 p.m. photo, Groom and Yasuko are at the base of the Hillary Step, and it was reported Yasuko took 30 minutes to climb the step. This would place her at the top 2 minutes prior to Krakauer's reported time returning to the step, and would have them meet Krakauer just above the step and require the passing maneuver Groom mentions. While if Krakauer was indeed perched above the step, he would be well to Namba's right, and there would be no issue passing. Thus, based on the photographic evidence, it appears Krakauer's memory is entirely fabricated out of thin air. Looking at all the items that Krakauer claimed, there are not any Mountain Madness clients riding Krakauer's butt to the summit while he fixed the ropes. Instead, Krakauer headed out in front of the rope-fixing team while a Mountain Madness guide and Mountain Madness client remained behind fixing the ropes. He did not witness Sandy Pittman climb the step, as she was already at the top of the step at 1 p.m. He did not witness Yasuko Namba struggle up the step, as Mike Groom reported they ran into Krakauer after they had already cleared it. On the descent, Krakauer ran out of oxygen when he reached the Hillary Step, and Andy Harris did not accidentally turn his regulator to full flow, as the noise would have immediately alerted Krakauer that it was not turned off. This leads us to another Krakauer embellishment. In his May 20th account, he states that he was in a fuzz and couldn't recall the exact details of who climbed past him while he waited on the Hillary Step. This would be expected, because he had run out of oxygen, and likely the exact sequence of people climbing past him was not particularly important to anything and would not stick out in his memory. The mystery is why 3 years later, his recollection becomes crystal clear. In his postscript written in 1999, he suddenly has a vivid memory of exactly where Buchrev was standing when Krakauer was hooked up to descend the Hillary Step, which this somehow relates to whether Buchrev had one conversation or two conversations with Scott Fischer above the step. My main reason for doubting the second conversation, however, comes when I saw, as I began heading down the Hillary Step, as I looked up one last time to check the rappel anchors before descending, I noticed that Fischer had already moved well above the small staging area where Harris, Adams, Buchrev, and I had congregated to clip into the rappel ropes. Am I certain that Buchrev didn't climb back up to Fischer and have a second conversation with him? No. But Anatoly, like the rest of us, was very cold and tired and exceedingly anxious to get down. As I rappelled over the lip of the step, Anatoly was shivering impatiently on the narrow ridge crest immediately above me. It's hard for me to conceive of what would have prompted him to climb back up and have another discussion with Fischer. Generally, after the passage of 3.5 years, one's memory of an event does not improve. But the magic memory of Krakauer was written in August 99, and at that point he remembers exactly where various people were standing while he was hooking up to rappel down the Hillary step after being without oxygen, by his own account, for at least 30 minutes. Of course, Krakauer needs that particular memory for some minor dispute he's having with Bukrev, and Bukrev, who had died 2 years prior to Krakauer's sudden memory improvement. I will not get into the Bukrev-Krakauer dispute, as to me it seems rather obvious what happened. The summit had not been reached that season, and a race was on to be first. Being first to the summit for a season is a big deal, and Krakauer did not know at that time that there was going to be a disaster that would dominate the narrative. So Krakauer runs up first to try to reach the summit, but he is beat to the top by Bukrev. Not surprisingly, Bukrev does not look good in Krakauer's book. I don't put anything more into it than that, because Krakauer seems to just invent things for his story. Initially, it was the Mountain Madness clients riding his butt to the summit. When that proved false, he blames a guide for screwing up his oxygen, and as the guide died, that story was not likely to be contradicted, unless you know that oxygen coming out of a tube makes noise. Between Scott Fischer's photo from the South Summit and Neil Beitelman's taken on the descent from the summit, it appears few factual statements made by Krakauer about the climb above the Hillary step were true. All the inaccurate statements have an extreme bias in favor of Rob Hall and Adventure Consultants, and against the members of the Mountain Madness team. In an upcoming video, I will look at the contract between Adventure Consultants and Outside Magazine, and how Rob Hall was paying for Krakauer to climb with him and had agreed to additional advertising with Outside Magazine. Thus, it should come as no surprise that Krakauer, a writer for Outside Magazine, would make Adventure Consultants look good, because they are the one paying his employers. And as soon as you look at his article, written for Outside Magazine, as just a publicity piece for a paying client, the whole thing makes sense.